Hello, everybody. Welcome to What Magic Is This? A podcast about magic, the occult, the paranormal, the supernatural, the esoteric, and the weird. My name is Douglas Batchelor. Hey, guess what? There's no time for jokes, no time for questions beforehand. We have an episode that had to be made right now. And time is of the essence with this episode. So I just want everybody to know that what we're going to be talking about today was picked by the Patreon supporters of What Magic Is This? Every couple of months, I put up a poll as to what kind of topics they want to hear. And this one came out right at the top. So I did an episode not too long ago with two other guests. It wasn't just myself and another guest. It was myself, a guest, and another guest. And I got some really good feedback for that one. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to try and do this again. So in this episode, we are going to be talking about a book. Well, 3 books. So I have my first guest is a returnee to What Magic Is This? They were on the episode about journeying. He is a magician and Thelemite, a frequent contributor to Where Did the Road Go podcast. He was the creative force behind the new Aeon English Kabbalah calculator. He is a crafter of beautiful ritual tools and instruments, as well as a mushroom cultivator. He has a lifelong interest in the paranormal and the occult, as well as a lifelong experiencer of out-of-body experiences. I would like to welcome back to What Magic Is This, Mr. Wren Collier. Wren, how are you today?
Hey, everyone. It's great to be back.
Thanks, Wren. And my second guest has studied and practiced magic as well as astrology for well over 30 years. He is a Santero Olorisha in Afro-Cuban Lucami, as well as a noted scholar on the subjects of medieval astrology and traditional magical systems. For the last decade, my guest has taken it upon himself to do the first translation into English since 1651 of the subject we will be discussing today. I am talking about Mr. Eric Purdue, whose translation of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy goes off of the original 1533 Latin edition, which will be released in November of 2021. Eric, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
So, as I said, this is going to be a 3-way discussion. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and I just want people to listen up for this one, because when you get down to it, there's a few books that some people will always consider being the book for the occult or magic. And I'm just going to say, when this question is asked to people, like, what's the one book about magic that everybody needs? It's 3 books of occult philosophy by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, without a doubt. It's either that or somebody will say the Kabbalion, and we're just kind of like, what? Get out of here. Like, shoot, through the door.
We don't talk to those people.
We don't talk to those people, absolutely. But I just want to ask, what can each of you tell us about the world, but more specifically, the magical world of Europe right before Agrippa wrote even one word of 3 books of occult philosophy?
Well, Agrippa comes from the typical Renaissance academic world at that time. And it wasn't that there were a lot of competing opinions outside of the church.
Right.
But, you had a lot of luminaries like, Ficino, Trithemius, people like that, who all kind of put their stamp on what magic was, how that fit in the Christian world or Christianity at that time. And Agrippa basically would have grown up reading these sources. You have that on as one side, and then you have, I don't really feel a lot of the folk magic or ceremonial magic in the way that people think of it today as part of Agrippa's world. He doesn't really discuss, the grimoire so much in 3 books.
No.
I was a little surprised myself. I guess to put it simply, he's coming from a place where you had an influx of all of these ancient books that were, coming into the mainstream. And the academics at the time had to figure out how this fit in with the Christian worldview. And so basically that's the inspiration for something like this.
Yeah.
Wasn't that also around the same time too that you saw like sort of wealthy families in Italy commissioning translations of works and stuff? So I feel like a lot of that was entering the scene around that time, although my dates make me off. I'm less of a historian. So
Yeah, I mean, give or take 100 years, 150 years or so. I mean, we're being kind of vague here. But it's interesting. I've been actually just over the last couple of weeks been reading about what influences Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum would have had. And it really isn't as cut and dry as people would assume. It wasn't like, people always think of the Hermeticum being, basically inspiring a new kind of magic, but there really isn't a lot of magic in the Hermeticum so much. And I just recently found out that there were certain passages left out of Ficino's translation, which can certainly change one's interpretation of Hermeticum in general, or Hermetica in general. And it's interesting that you have some other people at the time which are less well known, like Lazzarelli, who did Crater of Hermes, who pretty much did get it.
Right.
And you don't hear much about him today, but
no. Magic was in and around the time in the 16th century. It was still a big thing. The Renaissance was well underway, but definitely magic was still a part of a lot of people's lives. Now, can either of you speak a bit? Because the reason I bring this question up somewhat early is because we have this idea that Agrippa just did all of this work himself. He brought in all of this information. It was just like a one-man band, basically. But if you read a lot of the biographies, even short biographies about Agrippa, they do mention that there was like a circle of people, about 16 to 17 people, which provided Heinrich with some guidance and some sources that eventually made their way into 3 books of occult philosophy. Can either of you speak on this strange group of people?
It wasn't a magical group in the sense of, like an OTO or something like that. Right. It was more of a loose but maintained mutual aid group of friends with similar interests, I guess. And I feel that a lot of the material, because we're going to talk about this later, but Agrippa wrote the first edition of 3 books when he was 23, 24, something like that.
Yeah, 24.
And I think that his association with this group is instrumental in that, because there's no way that he could have accumulated everything himself. And with things like Picatrix, for instance, I don't think he ever had a copy of Picatrix, because of the way it's sourced. It's these little snippets throughout the book that he's taking. He doesn't seem like he had knowledge of. There's vast sections of Picatrix that could have been in 3 books, but weren't. Right. That would have fit the material. So I think it has a lot to do with it, and it helped him kind of organize his thoughts on the matter and helped him obtain some of the sources, because I'm quite sure he didn't have all the books that he was sourcing.
Right.
Yeah, I was really fascinated when I found that, like, his correspondence and all the letters that he wrote over the years weren't, or to this day aren't really like translated, right? So that would be a really cool thing to read, like his letters to these other people of these circles. And it kind of reminds me a bit, this like gets back into my like ufology interest, but it reminds me of what Valley writes about the Invisible College.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Like this idea of a loose group of researchers who are sort of bouncing ideas and information off of each other in a field that may be seen as sort of outside the bounds of polite society or I guess, orthodox thinking. They want to discuss these ideas with other people, but they have to maintain this loose association in order to do so. And that's kind of what Agrippa's circle reminds me of, right? Like a group of people who can't necessarily talk about this stuff with other people, but have found camaraderie in each other.
And it seems that there were definitely some strong measures being taken to vet people in the group. And I read that also that Agrippa possibly was one of the people to kind of put the final, approval on things.
Young. Some of these people were way older than him. Like, why was it Agrippa? Do you think that it was just they liked the cut of this guy's jib and like, sure, give it to the kid who's a Luke Skywalker of the occult? Like, he's the one. Like, it's so odd to me because the names that are in this group, some of them are fairly well-to-do, older, but I guess, this kid was a bit of a prima donna
he was talented
right off the get-go. Yeah.
Well, there's I just bought it, the Dictionary of Western Gnosis and Philosophy or Mysticism. In the article on Agrippa, they just briefly mentioned that, Agrippa is well known for this one book. And it's a shame that he wasn't, because he's actually a great thinker, and he's not known for all this other material that he did. So I imagine that that's what they were probably seeing. It wasn't the proto 3 books Agrippa that they were seeing. They were seeing this very intelligent intellectual.
Soldier, spy. He was the James Bond. He was James Bond and James Joyce rolled into one. Who knows?
I did want to mention as an aside, I was looking at the sort of list of speculated members of this group, and it mentioned Fassius, and it didn't have any other information. My current speculation is that that's Fassius Cardan, who was most famously in Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia. There's a relation of him conjuring the sylphs, and it was a guy he was an alchemist and he lived during the right time period too. Like I looked up when he was alive, so that may have been Fassius Cardan in the group as well.
You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen.
I mean, I don't have any proof of that, but the name stood out, and I was like, I know another Fassius who's also like an alchemist and lived during the same time period. So
crazy.
And we're talking about how young he was. I mean, we're talking about the first edition of Agrippa coming out when he was 23, but this is before that.
Yeah.
So he was not a 23-year-old. He was what, 19? Maybe 20.
That's incredible.
When I was 19 or 20, I was definitely not that person.
I mean, he graduated from university at like 16.
16. Yeah. That may have been more normal. I mean, that by itself may not be unusual, but it's really precocious.
Definitely. So I have a speculative question to ask here. It's kind of a two-parter question. What do you think was going through Agrippa's mind? Why did he want to write these 3 books? And do you think that Agrippa was a practitioner of magic?
Well, Agrippa pretty much says this in his introductory letters, that, to a certain extent, he's kind of repeating what is off. It's a very common Renaissance trope of, repairing what has happened to magic, astrology, what have you. And in some cases, reclaiming its glorious past from, Arabic corruptions, but not realizing, of course, the Arabs actually preserved a lot, but that's definitely part of it. I think what he doesn't say is that, we were talking about these luminaries earlier, Ficino, Trithemius, Johannes Reuchlin, other people like that. All these people, had their own theories on reconciling magic and Christianity and what magic's place was in the world. And inevitably, each one of these definitions could present a problem or a gap. And Agrippa wanted to fix that, ironically, by quoting everybody, but very creatively, I think. When you think about quoting people from other books, quoting texts, passages from other books, while formulating a new argument out of those quotes is pretty fascinating to me. So there's that. I mean, there are things like Ficino diminishes, nous, especially in his Hermetic material, although he kind of gets around it by way of Plato, but he diminishes that a little bit and sees magic as working with your presiding, daimon, with the divine, that kind of a thing. You have, Trithemius saying that, the soul is raised through degrees of the divine, but he also believed that there was such a thing as true magic, true astrology, true alchemy that integrated the free will, which sounds very modern, actually. So, things like this, and Agrippa would have read all of this and probably had his own questions, and he had the benefit of having these sources available. I mean, that the fact that you've already had all these people asserting their own opinions, he had that benefit of having all this corpus to draw from to create his own. And he just happened to be, I think, probably one of the last great statements on magic during the Renaissance. I mean, no one else really did anything notable in that way after him, which I think says something too. But I think it was just that he needed to create his own definition and fix the problems as he saw them.
I think there's a degree of youthful exuberance as well, right? Because he was so young when he wrote it. And I almost get that impression from Trithemius's letter back to him after he sent him the manuscript copy, of sort of just being a young guy who wants to compile all of these things that he's learned and like put it out in the world, right? Not necessarily. I'm not trying to say like Agrippa was trying to flex on everybody by putting out books of occult philosophy, but sort of the same idea. Because I get the feeling like in Trithemius' letter, he's like, "This is great and all, dude, but be careful how much you talk about this, right? Like, sort of go easy on it a little bit."
Do you think he actually dabbled?
He mentions, I think specifically, some things that he does, and various. It's like sprinkled throughout, but he's like, "I have done this thing," but he tends to not elaborate too much on it. But I think he did definitely practice.
And I tend to think the astrological part was more medical and maybe magical. I don't really see him doing, natal astrology or something like that. And he doesn't seem to be as interested in that. And again, you have this whole problem during the Renaissance of free will, because that's when it really started being hammered in. I was also going to say to the earlier point that part of this too is, by writing something like this, how you showed what you knew. There's that too. So it's not just, bragging or flexing. There's some of that.
Got it.
But it's a thesis in some ways,
What do you think he, you might have just answered it, but what do you think he attempted to accomplish? Was it just what you said earlier, Eric, just trying to get this all in one place so that at least in his own mind, he has some kind of a synthesis of the occult and magic? Or do you think he had larger aims for it?
He wanted to reform magic. And this was,
right,
partially inspired by Trithemius and by Reuchlin, because he was a Reuchlin aficionado. He did lectures on Reuchlin. And, Reuchlin, believed that magic could be rehabilitated through religion.
Who is Johannes Reuchlin, just so the listeners know who we're talking about here?
Johannes Reuchlin is most famous for writing a book called On the Art of Kabbalah, which, so he was sort of the first person, I don't know if he was the first actual person, but the person who popularized Christian Kabbalah and was a profound impact on Agrippa. But he was an impact on Agrippa before that book was published, because he wrote an earlier book called De Verbo Mirifico, or Wonderful Words. And that's what Agrippa's really, I think the book that inspired Agrippa probably the most to write 3 books, because the skeleton of 3 books is in that book. Reuchlin also divided the world up into 3 parts, and actually Trithemius did too. It's a very common kind of thing. I can't remember the parts, but Trithemius had 3 different divisions, I think. But this was all in the background. But Trithemius was the encourager, and Reuchlin was the inspiration, I think.
Crazy, yeah. So I want to actually get into the book here, because we've been doing a lot of talking about what we think of
speculation,
how he wrote. A lot of speculation, but that's cool, because we besides his letters, which we don't have a ton of those, but what do each of you want people to get into their heads even before, say they get a copy, Eric, of this new translation, before they even open it up? What is important for each person to understand about this book? Because a lot of people might be a little bit lost.
The first thing is that it's not a reference book, and it is intended to be read cover to cover. I know this is a bit tough, but especially the JF translation is tough. The Tyson edition is pretty readable, but Agrippa was very organized in the way he wrote 3 books as a whole. And the chapter headings are very deceptive as being complete in and of themselves. But it's actually, I always sort of compare it with the way some recipe books are written, where they'll have a chapter on sauces, for instance, and then they'll say later on, use this sauce, make this sauce, but you have to kind of thumb through the book to find the sauce.
Right.
So Agrippa's kind of like that, except that he doesn't tell you. He expects that you would have internalized the book and read it like a good scholar and all that. Mm-hmm. That's one thing I want people to understand, because that's one of the reasons I think why people sometimes think that it doesn't tell them anything, because you just read these chapter headings and it just kind of gives you an overview. Right. And that's that.
I do think in a way he does kind of tell you that it's not a reference book in the sort of the first couple of chapters, and then later on, like he says very clearly that magic is a synthesis of sort of this natural philosophy, mathematics, and theology, with the mathematics incorporating things like astrology or celestial knowledge. And that's sort of your hint that like all 3 of these books have to be taken together, because by themselves aren't a complete system, like can't be used to do actual magic. And he mentions this again later in the 3rd book, where he says something about like none of these miracles can be achieved, can be worked by any man by religion alone, right? Unless you're like a saint or something, like
or nature alone.
Yeah, like you need to incorporate the natural philosophy and the astrology and the mathematics and the numbers with the religious and aspect of and the intellectual mind in order to have magic happen, in order to be an effective worker of miracles, basically. Like I fell into that trap when I originally found the 3 books, because I kind of knew about the 3 books of occult philosophy. It didn't have a copy and didn't reference it until I started studying under my mentor, who anytime we were putting together a ritual to do, he would say, okay, well, let's go consult Agrippa. He would pull open his book, 3 books of occult philosophy. He would go look at the tables, find the things that he needed, like the kami or whatever we were doing. And so like my first introduction to the book was that way. So I was like, oh, it's a really good reference book. And it wasn't until later when I sat down and actually read it all the way through, I kind of realized, oh, you can't just refer to any one piece of it. It kind of has to be taken holistically.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, this is stepping outside of Agrippa, but one of my favorite passages, it's only in the Arabic Picatrix, it's not in the Latin version, that says that magic is a kind of a syllogism, in a way, that in order to understand magic, you have to embark on a course of human knowledge. So, astronomy and, geometry, all these things. And then once you complete this course of learning, you realize that magic actually was at the beginning of that learning. But you can't understand that unless you go through the whole journey first. It's all about the journey. It was there within you all along.
That's right.
But I kind of think that I look at 3 books sort of in the same way, that that he's sort of doing that he defines magic right at the beginning of the book, but you can't understand what magic is from that chapter alone. You have to read the entire book, because he goes into extreme detail. And then by the time you finish the book, you realize, okay, well, the first chapter really does, kind of lay it out for me, but you can't really fully understand that at that time.
So let's jump into the first book again. And yeah, the first book of the 3 books of occult philosophy is about the natural world. And it begins with Agrippa's definition of magic. So how do you both feel about Henry's description of magic?
I like it. It has sort of become my standard definition.
Okay.
The thing I always hated about the often repeated Crowley definition is that it leaves out spirit. So basically it's will creating change, but that could also describe, making toast. When you think about Agrippa's definition, that it requires, incorporating all 3 worlds through the magician to actually create the magic. And then you compare that with something like, let's say a ritual, especially an old-timey ritual. If you take out the spirit part of it, you basically have theater. And theater is perfectly valid, but it's not necessarily magic. So I think, and people often forget that you have to have that spirit component to it. I think the last few years with all these new translations coming out, people are questioning the psychological approach more than they used to, but that's been forgotten until, I guess, recently. It's important.
Yeah. I mean, and definitely it sort of has become my definition as well, because it's very logical if you think about it. It's like, if you're doing a ritual to affect change in the world, whatever you're trying to do, like, you're going to need material components that you pull from the natural world, whether it be stones, herbs, incenses, smells, like all of these like physical, gross material things. Then you also need like correct astrological timing, because he says, and a lot of other sources say, like, if you don't do things with the correct astrological timing, right elections, planets in detriment or whatever, if you don't follow that stuff, then you're not going to get the effect you're looking for, right? Because the timing is just as important as the material components, which is just as important as the spirit aspect. Like you talked about, Eric, you have to also incorporate the theological aspects. You have to know what spirit you're calling. And one thing I think that he talks a lot, maybe we'll get to this when we talk more about the 3rd book, is like imagination, right? Like he talks about the power of like just pure visualization and imagination and force of presence exerting itself in the world. Like he talks about Alexander glowing in front of the barbarians and the face of Moses like shining. It's like that. So that was actually something I was like rereading it over the past a couple weeks, and there's like some interesting. I'm not going to say that Agrippa was talking about chaos magic in the 1500s, but there are these interesting little tidbits throughout that I think are reflected in later sort of chaos magic ideas about some of the most important parts of magic being your force of will and your belief in that it is going to work. I think he says explicitly, I can't remember which book it's in now, but that an important aspect is complete faith in the operation, believing that it's going to work and having faith in your own abilities as a magician. His definition of magic has fit my experience of doing magic, for sure.
Cool.
And I also want to add too that I also like to, because I know that Western magic is only one part of the world of magic, and we can't, give sole importance to that. So I like to think that, even though Agrippa is talking about this in his worldview, that if you take the bare bones definition of what he's talking about, and when you strip away all the cultural and historical things that are part of that for Agrippa, it actually does apply, I think, to most magic. So I do leukemy, so we don't do astrology in that at all, but we use numbers. Numbers is part of that. So I think it's always there in some form. I mean, there's some people use magical alphabets. Magical alphabets are part of the celestial world.
Yes,
they're actually part of the celestial and divine world. There's a little bit of both in there, but that's there too. So most magic around the world, I mean, everybody uses natural things. That's universal, and I think that the divine part is also pretty universal. That second world is a little bit tricky, I think, for some cultures. But when you kind of strip that down, okay, it could be astrology, it could be numbers, it could be letters, it could be all these things. In some minute way, it's there.
So the first book is called it's not called, but it is about the natural world. Why is this important? And why is this first book? Why did he start off with the natural world, do you think?
That's where we are. It's important because one of the things I like about it is how he's so methodical about the way he unfolded the material in the book, because he starts out, which almost no modern book on magic starts out with, which is a definition of magic. But then he goes into the elements, and the elements are the bare bones of the natural world, and it's also the bare bones of doing magic from a Western standpoint.
Right.
So we have to start there because we can't avoid having this sort of physical component to it. So yeah, I think it's logical to start there because you can't start with the divine. It's too lofty to begin with. you have to build that up.
Right.
Yeah, it's almost like it's starting with what, like you said, it's like where we are. It's almost starting with what people know best. And I think there is something to say too about how, like you mentioned, folk magic previously, and there's a lot of sort of weird medical remedies and sort of almost folk magic-y thing about having the tongue of a dog in your shoe in order to prevent dogs from barking at you. And actually, one thing, I think he got this from Albertus Magnus, but I had a moment of flashing realization where he talked about cloth that had been stained with the menstrual blood of a virgin could never be set on fire or something. And there's actually in a long lost friend, the sort of powwow Pennsylvania Dutch thing that's in that. And I think they got it from Albertus Magnus too, not Agrippa, but you put it under the eaves of a house to prevent a house from burning down.
There's only a way to test that.
And I think you had a question about this, Doug, too, about what do we make of sort of these natural remedies and all of the sort of weird biology that he's pulling from Pliny and stuff into this. Yeah. It's very strange, but I sort of love this part of the 3 books of occult philosophy because I think it's the most fun just to browse with. I don't know. I love the histories and all of these weird sort of ideas about biology that existed sort of in the pre-modern era.
Well, there's a couple things to take from that too, because Agrippa is just quoting Pliny the Elder or Albertus Magnus. It doesn't mean he actually did these necessarily. And what's telling is that there are some plants that Pliny mentions that no one has ever translated. And I have no reason to believe that Agrippa knew what they were either.
Yeah.
So he was just, repeating. So there's that. I mean, I don't think he tested, putting the tongue of a chameleon on the roof of your house to stop lightning or whatever. But again, if there was only way to test that.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think from our modern era, these are also all examples of how natural things interact with the world. So even if that specific example doesn't apply today, and there are other examples like the Oxyrhynchus fish that if it touches a ship, it turns to stone.
Yeah, it turns to stone.
It's a mythical fish,
right?
But it doesn't really matter. That's an example of magical contagion, for instance. How one of the ways that magic works. So instead of just making fun of it, which we all do, try to think, okay, well, how does this? What's the point of him putting it in the book to begin with?
Yeah, and I guess we're going to get into the virtues, but that's sort of where it comes from. And I think that's the most applicable aspect to actually doing magic, is understanding the correspondences between these natural materials and all the other elements of what you're trying to do.
When you're reading the very first book, the word virtues comes up quite often. So what does he mean by virtues? Just if you want to let the people know. Virtues, what are they?
In a nutshell, well, it literally translates as power.
Nice.
But we're not going to use that word because it sounds strange. In a nutshell, it's basically powers that are engrafted into natural things by the divine.
So it's a fairly Neoplatonic thing, basically.
Yeah. Very.
Yeah, and it makes sense in a certain way too, especially in its relation to spirits, right? Like, why would a spirit be afraid of something that was made of a lion, right? Well, because lions are solar and they represent power. And if you think about these entities being imaginal in nature, right? Like they live in sort of the world of the intellect and imagination, then representations of things are literally the same thing as that thing, right? So a lion skin belt is the sun to them. And it's setting up the framework for the later books, right? Like that's why he's giving us these correspondences to begin with, because these are kind of like where you're starting. Because like we mentioned before, you can't really do the magic unless you incorporate all three sort of parts of it together. And gathering up the material components are going to be kind of the first thing you're going to do when you're formulating a ritual, I suppose.
And then later on, he goes into this same idea with words.
Right.
So it goes into the magical, incantations, and Agrippa goes through a long list of taking passages from the Bible that explicitly describe some power of God, and using it as part of the incantation, sort of remind the spirits that, well, hey, this is what you have to be afraid of, and why you have to listen to me, because I'm invoking God here.
And the correspondence stuff, I haven't really done a show on correspondence yet, but can somebody simply explain what Agrippa, or what you were talking about as far as correspondence is when one gets 3 books of occult philosophy?
Well, that goes into the virtues. That's the illustration of the virtues, I think. The most valuable thing that Agrippa does with the correspondences is not the lists of plants and animals and stones, is that he gives the logic.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I hear over and over and over again by people is they make these kind of definitive statements on what a plant or animal or stone or whatever is associated with, as if it's this finite thing, and people often complain that there are these discrepancies in different sources. And Agrippa is a perfect example. We always associate iron as being martial, and Agrippa says that it's Saturn.
Right.
But when you go along his logic, it makes sense, because Saturn rules things that smell bad, and iron kind of smells bad, and kind of bloody, and kind of irony, I guess. It's ironic.
That's right. Isn't it? Do you think?
From most astrological texts, he's going to be absolutely wrong in saying that iron is Saturnine. But from a logical standpoint, it makes sense if you're going by qualities. And what I've told people over and over again is, at the end of the day, these elders that we're all listening to weren't just sitting there looking at lists constantly. They were using the same logic that Agrippa's using, and trying to apply that with things that they knew. And they're going to disagree sometimes. And so sometimes it's all correct. And one of my favorite things that Agrippa says is that, when we're talking about plants, is that, well, he says that everything is ruled by all 7 planets, first of all. Everything is. But usually 1 or 2 planets tend to dominate more than the others. And one example that he gives is with plants, all leaves are mercurial, all stems are, I guess, Jupiter, roots are Saturnine, thorns are Martial, flowers are Venusian, and the sap is going to be lunar. And it doesn't give anything to the sun, so I guess the sun's left out on plants. So by that logic, every flower is ruled by all the planets. So even a rose, you look at a rose and you dissect it, and it has thorns, and that's very martial in some ways. So you could theoretically use some of that for martial things, but you'll never see a rose as a martial plant. It's usually Venusian.
Yeah, and that's what I really thought fascinating about his discussion of virtues, because I remember, before I encountered the 3 books, looking at these big lists of correspondences and just thinking to myself, who originally came up with this? Who decided that this is bad, that, that's iron is martial or whatever?
That was Bob.
And from reading...
God, that guy's the worst.
3 books of occult philosophy, Agrippa takes the time to actually explain how to derive those virtues. Because I was also thinking a lot of the correspondences lists in Agrippa and in a lot of the texts that make up sort of the Western magical canon are European focused, right? It's European plants. So I was well, what if we wanted to develop a list of correspondences for New World plants? How would you determine as a magician what plants belong to which planet or whatever? And Agrippa helpfully explains exactly how to do that, which was just fascinating to come across when I first started reading this.
Yeah. The other part of this is that he uses certain substances are ruled by more than one planet. That was something that was picked up on my editors. They said, well, is this a mistake? And I'm like, no. And then every time he came up to is this correct? No, it's I said, this is traditional logic. And one of the ones that comes to mind is, sandalwood. Sandalwood is ruled by both Mars and Venus, and possibly even Jupiter, because going by the different kinds of logic that Agrippa would have used, all of those apply. And
Crazy.
That kind of messes with the 20th century Western academic mind, because everything has to be very specific and very categorized. And the world doesn't work that way.
I mean, that's what I thought was interesting about sort of the natural philosophy thing, because I think in this, right, you're seeing the beginnings of what would become biology and botany and other things, the idea of classification, of taking different plants and animals and minerals and separating them into groups based upon their properties. I think that definitely ends up moving away from sort of how chemistry moved away from alchemy. I feel a lot of natural sciences like biology and botany and other things sort of derived from natural philosophy to begin with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Very much so. Let's get into the second book here, gents, The Celestial World. Now, before we get talking about it, just how important was astrology to magic at the time?
Astrology, well, okay, that's complicated. So in Agrippa's world, astrology would be the underlying, I guess, language. That's one way to look at it, of magic. So the astrology kind of united all these different elements of magic to the Renaissance mind. The reason why it gets a little bit complicated is that when you start going into more some of the grimoire material, if that's the right word, there is some astrology and sometimes there's no astrology, but things like the Keys of Solomon, which I know is a little bit later. The astrology isn't as complicated. But to people like Ficino, Agrippa, and that whole crowd, it was the central thing that you needed to know to do magic, because if you didn't have the astrology right, the magic couldn't work. The underlying logic that he's using is that everything comes from God. The will of God has to go. I always look at it as filters through all of the spheres, the planetary spheres, and each one of those spheres is going to add their own little role to that will of God. So if you don't have your mind right with the celestial spheres in general, then you're not going to be able to to understand the will of God either.
And it's sort of reminds me of like a a prism, right? Like the spheres are like prisms.
Mm-hmm.
They're filtering sort of this divine light down into the manifestation of the physical world. And if those prisms or mirrors are blocked or not aligned properly, then the rays that would empower the natural world to accomplish what you're wanting to accomplish wouldn't be there. And I think that that's why they see astrology as key to it. I think he also mentions too that like all divination is useless without astrology as well, because even like geomancy is based sort of astrologically. So it's almost like the celestial world is sort of the first element you have to have there in order for things to be done on the natural world.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily literally agree with that statement by Agrippa, but I understand the sentiment. And the word that Agrippa uses is endued, which literally means to dress. And I kind of like that imagery of the will of God basically being clothed by each of the spheres in a way. So it's kind of like adding a little layer to it. And with the divination, it is interesting that was sort of a thing during the Renaissance, is to sort of astrologize a lot of different kinds of divination, because geomancy doesn't have to be astrological, really, but it is today for sure. But it could easily exist without astrology, and things like lots. But he would have seen lots as having its symbols sort of connected with the stars in some way too.
Right.
Even though the Greeks and Romans probably would not have looked at it that way.
Yeah.
But that was the thinking, at least.
And I think too, his father taught him astrology, right? So
they say that, but I don't know to what extent. Yeah, it definitely was a big part. He was a doctor though, too. And that was part of the doctor's toolbox. So, you have that whole issue back then, astrology and free will. Because free will, people think of free will as this kind of modern enlightened way of thinking. And free will really came about through the church, because you had to have free will in order to deny or accept Jesus. So the astrology, the natal astrology was a little bit problematic as far as the free will goes. Horary astrology was problematic. Electoral astrology is a little bit weird as well. Medical astrology is totally fine.
Yes.
So the existence of astrology itself is never questioned, even by the church. So I'm sure Agrippa did elections. And as a doctor, I think most doctors were doing astrology back then. So I'm quite sure he was at least doing that.
The second book is the one that's got a lot of the diagrams in there and all of the fun stuff. But how important is book 2, the celestial world, to the whole enterprise? Like the middle book, why is this a really important book in the 3 books?
Well, first of all, the ultimate goal here is to unite with the divine in some way. And the celestials are the way that you do it. Place it in its simplest way. And I think, as we already said, if you don't have your astrological mind right, then something is good. It's not just the magic, but I think any enterprise that you're doing according to Agrippa's thinking is going to be flawed in some way. You have to have that sort of in the underlying your life basically. But also, one of the, you're mentioning the tables and everything.
Yeah.
The tables on numbers that snuck up on me because at first I just kind of glossed through it.
Right.
I think a lot of people gloss through it. And then people started I noticed that people were questioning some of Agrippa's, like, why does he say this for this demon, for this thing and whatever. And since I translated it and I had a searchable document, I was able to find out other parts of the book where he was actually laying things out better. So everything in the tables is in the book for the most part.
Right.
I don't know why it took me a while to realize that, but it's definitely a shortcut.
It's tables, yeah.
Yeah, that is one aspect of the book that does actually work really well as a reference.
Yes.
And I don't know, I like tables. I'm like a D&D nerd, so I enjoy tables. So I really like those parts.
Do I have a book for you? The section on the proportions of man is interesting. The whole chapter is from Vitruvius. The diagrams are a little bit of a mystery to me.
Yeah.
Because I don't understand all the symbols that he puts there and why. Because they don't really correspond to any astrological text that I know of. And he doesn't explain that. That's one thing he doesn't explain. And he was His direct source was what is today a little known book called Harmonium Mundi by Franciscus Zorzi. That was actually, I know we haven't really talked about the original manuscript, but that was the missing piece between the manuscript and the final edition.
Okay.
Was that book. And anyway, so he got that entire chapter from Harmonium Mundi, complete with some of the diagrams, but the original diagrams have no astrological symbols in them. That's one thing I haven't been able to explain.
They do look really cool, though.
They do look cool.
I thought it was interesting, too, and something that I don't think gets a lot of play in Western magic, but it seems to be a big part of book 2 is harmonics and music in magic. Mm-hmm. A lot of it's sort of lost on me because I was never taught music or anything. So like a lot of the words, I don't know what they mean about chords and harmonies and stuff. But I think that's like a fascinating piece that I need to put together more in my mind. That's in the second book, but I never hear anyone talk about.
I have footnotes about those terms. You probably want to talk about the squares, I'm sure.
Yeah.
It's a very popular chapter.
Yeah. Well, tell us about the squares. So when you get book 2, what's up with these?
Well, there's a few things. So his source for those was from a book called Secretive Secretarium, but not the famous one attributed to Aristotle. It's a different one attributed to Ptolemy. And that is one of the few books I was not able to obtain. So I couldn't double check that one.
Does it actually exist?
Yeah, it exists at Oxford.
At Oxford?
Yeah.
Open the vaults, Oxford.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure if I went there, I could get it. I mean, or I could probably ask them for a microfilm copy or something. I don't know, but I didn't do it. I mean, judging from Agrippa, everything else in Agrippa, whenever he quoted something, it was pretty identical. He was very careful. So I have no reason to assume that this was any different. One of the things I noticed is that I can't remember if it's the JF and Tyson editions or if it's just the Tyson edition. I think it's JF and Tyson, but some of the planetary sigils are reversed.
Right.
I know Mercury's one of them.
Saturn, I think, as well.
Saturn's okay. It's Mercury and I think Venus or something like that. I know Mercury is definitely one of them because, hey, it's Mercury.
Just to interrupt you for a sec here, Eric, when Eric is saying JF and Tyson, he's talking about JF is what is attributed to the very first English translation of 3 books of occult philosophy that happened in the 17th century. And Tyson was a gentleman in the 20th century who took his translation off of the JF translation in the 90s, I believe. Was it the 90s?
93, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, 93. So just so everybody knows there.
Yeah, the Tyson is probably the one most people are familiar with, right? Like it got published by Llewellyn. I think it's still widely bought under that. And I mean, that's the edition I've got, at least until I can buy Eric's.
I have it too. And that edition, Tyson tried to make a lot of corrections as well. And some of them were definitely warranted, but Tyson didn't read Latin. So there were a lot of things that just weren't really caught, or he corrected things that really weren't errors to begin with. Yeah, with this, the sigils were reversed. I know Tyson tried to reconcile some of these sigils, and it was either Tyson or I think there was another writer who wrote about this, modern writer, who tried to reconcile the sigils. And there was a certain point where they said, okay, the superior planets, Jupiter, Saturn, the Sun, or Mars, that those make sense. The inferior planets don't make sense. That's part of the reason that things were flipped around.
Yeah. You got a whole chapter, like Appendix 5 in the Tyson version, where he tries to rectify all that. If people are interested and they have that edition.
When we're talking about squares, we're talking about individual squares of numbers, which add up to certain. It's like what's the best way of explaining it? It's a whole bunch of numbers arranged in a square in a grid pattern, and each planet has its own square. Some are larger than others, but that's what we're talking about. So if you do have a copy of 3 books of occult philosophy, when you see these squares just packed with a jumble of numbers, that's what we're talking about here.
The logic is pretty simple too with the squares. I was just discussing this with someone today that the smallest magic square you can have is 3 on all sides. And so all they did was they took the smallest magic square and went with the first planet, which is Saturn. And then they just went down the order of planets, adding as they went along. So by the time you get to the moon, it was like, what was it, 12 or something? I can't remember.
So let's move on to book 3. And book 3 is it's a hell of an ending for the 3 books.
It's the toughest book.
It is the toughest book by far. It's basically ceremonial magic is one of the titles that this book has been given. So it begins with Agrippa basically saying that magic is a quest for divine truths through religious exercises. Let's take this apart a bit. Do you both agree with Agrippa that that's basically all that magic is this quest?
Yeah, I would agree. And if you're to put it really simply, this is one of the missing components in a lot of magic today, is that, because we've sort of divorced ourselves from this cultural component that Agrippa came from, that existed. I mean, yes, things changed over the centuries, but Agrippa had more in common with the ancient world than we do with Agrippa today. So today there's this kind of disconnect. And I think that a lot of people forget that when you're doing a ceremony, you're interacting with or acting or reenacting something in order to connect with something that's divine. And I think today it's becoming a little bit easier, because we have so many good translations over the last, few decades. But it was a wasteland in the 90s. It was all psychological.
I guess, I don't know. I agree with Agrippa, but I also kind of separate things out of my head, because I tend to take this, I wouldn't say it's completely Crowleyan, but sort of idea that magic is like causing changing performance of will, at least like on a very basic level. Like I do believe that, even if I think that's a limited definition. But I do think that magic is like a technology for causing change in the world. And I think that the being led to divine truth is like is a side effect of doing and practicing magic. So it not necessarily is like the goal of magic, because for me at least, the goal of magic is to accomplish whatever thing I'm trying to accomplish at that moment, whether it's healing something or finding something that's lost for someone. Like I tend to sort of just focus on the goal that I'm trying to achieve. But Agrippa's not wrong in that by studying all of these things, like studying the motion of planets and stars and studying the quality of natural things and studying the nature of spirits and the intellect, you will be led to truth eventually through that research.
And when I talk about this disconnect that often happens today, is that what Agrippa is describing is that when he's talking about using religion to allow magic to work or to rehabilitate magic, what he's saying is that is that this isn't just simply like sitting down and saying, okay, I want to do a spell to cause something to happen. There has to be a place in the world for this thing to happen. So, and you can't just say, do a magical ceremony and say, okay, I want to make the sky turn green. There has to be something that can possibly happen.
Right.
Yeah. And even from a smaller, if you're thinking small and just say, okay, well, I want to get a raise. There's so many reasons why that can or cannot make sense for you. And it isn't all just about you. There's this greater, cosmological world that you're part of. And because you're not living in this bubble. And that's why I think the third book is so important, because you're sort of placing yourself in this greater cosmos. And I think this type of understanding, not necessarily just from Agrippa himself, but from just in general, is that helps create a what I call magical maturity. So that you understand what it is you're doing, why you should even do it or should not do it. I mean, I'm not speaking from a moralistic, no, you should never curse or anything like that. I mean, it's because sometimes that makes sense, but you have to have that maturity to understand, how does this fit in with the world? How does it fit in with my world? Does this even make sense to do to begin with? And that's part of I think, the point of understanding the third book, or the point of the third book, even though Agrippa doesn't explicitly say all these things.
No.
Yeah.
The occult to Agrippa is fairly religious. I know a lot of people, when they get into magic, that's kind of like the last thing that they want. For a lot of them, they're just like, I'm getting into magic because I want to get away from this whole religious stuff. But for Agrippa, yeah, it's about getting right with the divine. If you do that, you can avoid many pitfalls, including being deceived by demons. What can we say about how Agrippa presents religious magic in the third book?
So the place of religion is, I said it earlier, that ultimately the reason why you're integrating religion in with the magic is to give you an authority.
Yeah.
That's one reason, because, and the religion is what gives you that authority. It's also giving you that understanding your place in the world. I mean, to Agrippa, this is one of his main points, is that this is the cause of a lot of arguments during the Renaissance. First of all, is what constitutes licit magic and illicit magic.
Right. Yeah.
And this chapter basically addresses that. And he says it many times. In a nutshell, licit magic is any magic that acknowledges that God is the source of all of this.
Right.
And whenever you start bringing in just natural things, or if you believe in, demonic sources for magic, then that's illicit magic. So you can work with diamonds and angels and plants and animals and all sorts of things, as long as you understand that it's all coming from God, to Agrippa.
Right.
So that's a very major point that people don't I think miss a lot about this. That's part of the point of why he wrote 3 books, because he wanted to reconcile magic with the world at the time, and to show people that you just can't dismiss magic out of hand, because it's talked about in the Bible. Our church fathers talk about it, and they believe that it existed. So if it's in the Bible, then what's the good stuff and what's the bad stuff?
Yeah, and it's like you said, he sees it as the religion is your connection to the divine. And I thought it was interesting that he makes a point that, I mean, he was obviously a Christian. He says that many times, that Jesus Christ is Lord and that sort of stuff. But he makes a specific point that there are other religions, right, other than his religion, that those religions also have some aspect of the divine, right? Like they're worshiping basically the same God he is, or at least that's what he believes. And I thought that was fascinating to see that. It seemed like a very tolerant approach to things. But he also brings up, too, that I think the specific example he talks about is using the name of Christ to command evil spirits, and how if it's used profanely without a real belief in Christ, or sort of a real sort of, if you don't have any sort of religious fervor in that it's not effective at all. And I think that's a key, too, that these elements of magic work best, or maybe only work at all, when you also have this sort of religious connection to the divine at the end of it, sort of empowering the whole thing.
And I understand that religion is a dirty word for some people today, and there's, for justifiable reasons, and especially Catholicism and Protestantism and things like that. So that there's a lot of justifiable anger about these things. But I think that if you sort of step outside of that a little bit, you realize that there's a greater truth to this. And I mean, you see it all the time on Facebook groups. People saying, "Well, I don't really want to do Jesus here. Can I just do Hecate instead, or somebody?" Yeah. And the answer is maybe. I don't know, but you can't let that hang up stop you from kind of moving past it. But I also think it's important to understand that again, to understand this basic point that he's saying. I mean, to me, that this goes into astrology, because astrology as a whole has become very mundane today. It's divorced from any sort of religious practice except for planetary magic. But your average person doing natal astrology, they don't see that as being part of any kind of spiritual world necessarily. But to the ancient world, or especially the Neoplatonic world on, it was definitely part of that. And the different predictive tools in natal astrology were explicitly said to be part of certain Neoplatonic concepts. It's a lot bigger than just simply doing a ceremony and bringing God into it. One of the values of something like 3 books is to get you to ask these questions. It isn't whether the book is correct,
Right.
or but it's you have to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't agree with Agrippa in every single detail, but
Here's a big one that I think the whole demons and angels, because they do get brought up a bit. And I know in one of the versions of 3 books, the very end, he talks about how there's 2 kinds of ceremonial magic. You got the theurgy, and then you have the Goetia, and Goetia's for the bad people and theurgy's for the good people. But he still has angels and he has demons in 3
mm-hmm.
books. What's up with that?
Well, because during that time, diamonds, which is what he would have used, not demon, were not evil, explicitly evil. Some were. So this comes into the whole, chain of being that he talks about in actually all 3 books. In fact, the 3 books are the chain of being. But so you have different kinds of spiritual forces, and so it starts with God, and as you start descending, you have the intelligences, and you have angels as well. So the angels are considered to be obviously very high spirits, but they don't have any free will. But the diamonds are more terrestrial, who have a little bit of free will, but each thing on the earth is, each person, every enterprise, everything, every place has a diamond associated with it, sometimes multiple. He quotes Iamblichus, where he says that there is a diamond of profession, for instance, which I actually started connecting that with astrology. That's what got me thinking about the astrology, is that if we're not working with a ball of rock or a ball of gas, what is it that we're working with? Anyway, that's a whole other digression. But yeah, so the diamonds would be associated with the more terrestrial things. And the benefit of diamonds is that because they're more terrestrial, they understand us better. So they can be beneficial for making things happen a little bit faster. So, when you're dealing with God directly, or gods, if you're being polytheist, they kind of work on God time. And so sometimes you employ the diamonds because they tend to sort of get things going. This kind of goes into a little bit with in Arabic, in the Arabic world, they have, the genies, or, the jinn. It's a very similar type of concept.
I mean, you see that pop up in Goetia and a lot of other sort of evocational practices, right? Where it's not necessarily the best idea or the most effective to contact a king directly, right? It's often much more effective to go through intermediary spirits or contact someone kind of lower on the food chain and get them to relay the message upstairs or downstairs, I suppose. And I think that's something interesting too, because Agrippa doesn't necessarily think that it's wrong to deal with evil spirits, but he specifically makes the point that evil spirits are controlled or like bound by good spirits, which is something that I think is like an interesting reinforcement of Rudd's Goetia later on, where you have the 72 angels of the Shem HaMephorash sort of binding their respective goetic demons.
I kind of look at it to make a comparison, sort of, like if you wanted to join the mafia, you don't go to the boss. Say, hey, I want a job. Usually you start out parking cars like the Goodfellas.
Mm-hmm. That's a very short Scorsese movie, that one. It was only 6 minutes long.
Yeah, I mean, most people don't realize that Goodfellas is an allegory for diamonds and ceremonial magic. Yeah, so
that's right. There we go. New fresh eyes to look at that film. The third book seems to follow in the ideas of Marsilio Ficino, who I talked about a bit in my Hermeticism episode. Ficino had this idea that you have to put the individual operator and their self-understanding, in quotes, their genius, at the center of ritual magic. Now, how influential of a move was this to include in the 3 books of occult philosophy?
It's very influential, and it's vital because basically the magician is being a medium, or is the medium for enacting all of this. Because otherwise, all of these spirits are just doing their thing. It's sort of like, I use a lot of cooking analogies. It's sort of the same thing. I mean, all these ingredients just exist, but the dish isn't going to happen unless the medium of the cook is going to make that dish. I often think about this I do a lot of comparisons with my leukemy practice. And one of the central concepts there is something called the Ori, which is the sort of your connection to the divine. It's symbolized as the top of your head. So a lot of the work that you're doing is the Ori connecting with someone else's ori, like during a reading, or your ori acting with an orisha or something else. So that's how the action's actually happening, is all these disparate elements physically. I mean, the magician's physically doing things as well, but the magician's spirits, attending spirits, are also allowing or not allowing these things to happen for the magician as well. That's another element to this, and that's one of the things that I think people don't think about are these attending spirits, giving permission essentially, for the magic to happen. Because a lot of people just think it's like, well, if I want to do something, then I just do it, and maybe it'll work, maybe it doesn't work. There's this interplay, going on.
And see, this is a part that I like not familiar with, because I'm not as familiar with Ficino. But would you say that this idea sort of gets translated in later ideas of like the HGA, or having this sort of personal attending spirit that can, I know Agrippa mentions, I forget if it's the genius or not, but that these spirits can bring things to you in dreams, or like your sort of attending spirit can bring you things in dreams or relay things to you. And that sounds just like HGA stuff, but I didn't know if that there is a direct line there, or if it's just different people stumbling upon sort of the similar thing. Like some of these, like you're mentioning, some of these things are like universal, right?
Yeah, there's Ficino, but there's also they're also getting this from Iamblichus, because that's almost the whole point of Iamblichus, and he was certainly well known, his book. But what's interesting is, I think what Ficino's talking about is when you compare that with something like the Abramelin ceremony, is you're doing this ceremony to basically identify and bring this HGA to you.
Holy guardian angel, everybody. Holy guardian angel.
Yeah.
It's an angel. Everybody's got one, supposedly.
HGA is not
no.
But what Ficino's talking about, I think, is that these are spirits that are just there. I mean, you really don't have to do anything to bring them to you, in my mind. That's how which is an interesting dynamic. I mean, because nowadays people concentrate on trying to bring this to them, but why wouldn't you have that with you?
Yeah. I mean, at least my perception of HGA type material, or that whole idea, I've always seen it as, well, this thing has always been there. It's been there since you incarnated. You just have to learn how to tune to the right radio station to talk to it. You got to learn how to talk to it.
Yeah.
But it's always there. It's just, you can't understand it, and it can't understand you.
Yet.
Or you could just, or you just become
an
idiot.
So the third book, we said earlier that this is where the rubber meets the road. How important is the third book to the whole project? And is this the book that has the most to say to the magician?
Yes, and it's the least fun.
Yeah. Because people are really turned on by the correspondences and the planetary seals. But at the end of the day, you need to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that's what the third book is. I think that is just, I don't know, sorely missing with a lot of practice today. It's really the boring part. It's if all of this is supposed to work through divine connections, then you justifiably would have to spend most of your time understanding what that divine is. And that's not necessarily going to happen by doing ceremonies. There's a lot of, there's this argument today between, armchair magicians and non-armchair magicians. But the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of armchairing that's necessary. Yeah, absolutely.
I've said this a couple of times, but I think the whole thing has to be taken holistically, right? Like the third book in isolation is useless. The second book in isolation is useless. You sort of have to combine all three. So I do think the third book is important to the whole. As to what it says to the modern magician, I don't necessarily think that it's like the key to the three books, right? Because I do believe that they are all part of a whole, right? So it's not necessarily that. And I apologize if this is like a later question, but I think at some point, a lot of people, their criticism of the three books of occult philosophy and why they turn to the fourth book or the Magus or whatever, is that they don't think it's like practical. It doesn't have practical stuff in it. And I don't necessarily think that's true, because I think the third book kind of bring some of the things together from the other two.
So let's talk a little bit more of the history. What happens after Agrippa finishes the 3 books? There's something that occurs, Eric. What is it?
He basically sent this to Trithemius. Trithemius approved the book. And at some point, that book leaked out and it was copied and disseminated in secret. And I don't know if I'm jumping ahead too quickly, but that was also part of the impetus for doing the revised edition of 3 books, because Agrippa wanted to make sure that, 20 years have passed. And there was a big difference between the 23-year-old Agrippa and the 40-something-year-old Agrippa, whatever he was. And so he wanted to make sure that he was able to control, basically control the message.
Right.
And so he revised it pretty much from scratch. The original version of 3 books was maybe a third shorter or so, give or take. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of things happened during that span because Roy Clint came out with The Art of Kabbalah, which influenced him greatly, and Harmonia Mundi was published as well. And if you look at a lot of the missing material, now this isn't 100% true, but a lot of the material that's in the final edition versus the first edition, a lot of that comes from Harmonia Mundi, the forgotten book.
The forgotten book, for sure. In the interim from the original manuscript to the revised edition, Agrippa does this thing, and there's still a lot of speculation, but he kind of says that it could be one of the most sarcastic things ever written. It's on the Vanities of Arts and Sciences, but he basically says, like, I was a fool when I was younger. Magic, I take it all back. But it could also be read as, no, I don't. And I'm throwing all of the toys out of the pram. And no, if we can't have magic, then we can't have arts and sciences. So what do you guys make of this idea that Agrippa kind of like said that he doesn't do the magic stuff anymore? In as many words, I'm overly simplifying it, but what do you make of this?
Well, the first thing that's important to understand is that on the uncertainty of the advantages of science and blah, 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 that's really a long title.
It is.
But one of the purposes of the book is it's almost a satire. It was essentially written to lampoon how humans believe that all this human knowledge that we've accumulated is so amazing. So he systematically went through there and made fun of everything. And I didn't put this in my translation, but at the end of the JF translation, he has those little tiny chapters about Goetia and things like that. That actually comes from that book. So I didn't put that in there. So whether he was serious, I don't believe it was a serious retraction. It's a multi-layered thing. In some ways, he had to distance himself as a magician. There is that. But the important, I guess, foundation to Agrippa's criticism is that he believed that there should be the difference between faith and reason needed to be distinguished. That's the big reason why he wrote on the Vanities of the Sciences. And he believed that thinkers confuse these things and confuse the study of things that humans created versus things that were divinely created. And that at the end of the day, divine things could not be debated. So when he wrote 3 books, that's part of the reason 3 books exist, is to show that magic is part of the divine. So I don't think it was a real retraction. Besides, he had his haunted black dog.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say, part 2, I agree with what you said there, Eric. I don't have a lot to add, but that I think it's also possible too, at that point in his life, Agrippa amassed a pretty notorious reputation, right? Like people sort of knew who he was. And I think that if he wasn't being completely sarcastic, maybe he was trying to distance himself from that reputation a bit, because I imagine that it was causing him problems, because I know he moved around a lot. He kept having to find different jobs. He wasn't necessarily leading a very charmed life, especially in his later years. So
he had a habit of saying the wrong thing to the wrong people at the wrong time.
Yeah.
Bless him for it.
But he was also a true believer, I think. He was a true believer. And I think not just a Christian, but he was a true believer in the things that he said. And I think that there was a bit of a naive, these people, that what they're saying is actually correct, but they just say it the wrong way all the time and they just piss everybody off.
Yeah.
I think that was Agrippa.
Yeah.
Well, what's funny is that he actually warns about that. I mean, he talks a lot about the importance of silence and not talking about these things to people who wouldn't understand. And even, I think he's quoting someone in that chapter, but he says something about how if you reveal these secrets to people, they will laugh at you if they're not like on the same level you are. And at worst, they may use it to harm you or do ill things in the world in general. So it's like he didn't even follow his own advice in publishing the 3 books.
Around the time 3 books was published, because this was part of, he basically obtained imperial privilege to publish several books. Mm-hmm. And he published several books right around the same time, things that he had already written. Mm-hmm. And Agrippa was the last one of that group. And every time he published a book, and some of these books, I mean, by today's standards, you look at them, they're pretty benign. Mm-hmm. He did the one on the defense of women.
Right.
And I mean, really, we look at it today and he seems pretty enlightened. But every time he did this, he had this, very lofty goal in writing he wrote, and then it would end up, pissing off a cardinal or somebody, and they would issue an inquisition in his absence so he couldn't defend himself. Mm-hmm. And then he would either go somewhere else, or he had very important friends that would bail him out. And that's what happened with 3 books, actually, is that's why he has those letters to Herman von Wied, who was essentially that guy. He kept him out of jail,
Yeah. Amazing. How popular was 3 books when it was released? Was it like a smash bang hit? Was it the Da Vinci Code of its day, or was it the slow burner?
It was not a slow burner. I mean, his reputation was made pretty much immediately. Faust is based on Agrippa in a lot of ways. And that's not much later. And I think that it makes sense because there's really no other book that encapsulates the magical philosophy as this book does. You mentioned Trithemius, we mentioned Ficino, we mentioned Reuchlin. Nobody did it at this scale before. So I think people recognized its importance for good or ill immediately.
And it also was one of those things where if there were segments of grimoires where they needed something to correspond to something else, it would just be Agrippa's correspondence. It did become that reference that we tell people not to do when they read this book. It did become that for a lot of people when they were writing down their own grimoires of their own, which would later come to be everything that we have today.
It's in the Golden Dawn. It's in every Wiccan book on herbs. There's something from Agrippa in that.
Definitely, yeah. And to this day, it's still incredibly popular. We did bring this up a little bit earlier, but I did say in a previous episode that I did with Eric about Eric Arneson of the Arnemancy podcast about Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. I called it a gun without a trigger, by which I mean it doesn't really tell you how to use all of the knowledge within the book to put it to ritual. Do you think this is a fair assessment, or can one actually do rituals straight from the 3 books?
This is kind of a 2-part thing, because I've thought about this a lot. I think that everything you need is in the 3 books of occult philosophy, because I've thought a lot about, like, say, for instance, in the Lesser Key of Solomon, right? Like, you have the long invocations and bindings and stuff but you compare that to other grimoires and they're all a little different, but you start thinking about, well, what are these things? Like, these are prayers that most of the people doing these things were in the church anyway. They were clergy. They probably wouldn't have needed a grimoire to know, like, the incantations or bindings or whatever, right? They would have just be things that they would just know. I think Agrippa makes a lot of assumptions in that some of this stuff is like stuff that you would just know, right? You don't necessarily need him to write it all out for you. Some of it, he's kind of giving you the theory about why it all works and how it all works, but not necessarily writing an instructional manual, right? Like grimoire is like, it comes from, or I think the speculation is that it comes from like the French word for grammar, right? Like, it's an instructional book. It's laying out everything for you. It's the wiki how for summoning demons or whatever.
Right.
The 3 books isn't meant to be that, but I do think that all of the elements you need to do magic are in the 3 books. And I don't discount too that he might have also intended a lot of the filling in the gaps was probably meant to be transmitted to you from a mentor or someone, like he had and Trithemius and his group of people. I'm sure they all helped instruct each other with their own bits of knowledge. So I think what people run into today is that they expect a book to provide all of the instructional stuff, like all the nitty gritty, do this, say that, trace out this pentagram or whatever.
Right.
When in reality, that stuff is meant to be transmitted to you from someone who already knows it.
We also can't forget that the people who could have read that book at that time would also had to have been educated. Mm-hmm. And if you're educated at that time, that meant that you understood Greek and Latin. You would have mm-hmm. known your Aristotle and Plato. You would have known mathematics and all these things. So when Agrippa mentions Plato, even though he's quoting a person who's quoting Plato, you still would have had some sort of knowledge that of Plato to begin with. And also, as far as being able to practice magic from the book, there are sections in 3 books, such as in book 2, where he does actually have the full elections to do certain things, which is, from Arabic sources. There's a little bit there. If you can internalize a lot of the logic, as Wren was alluding to, you could piece things together to do magic straight from that book. But it's not going to write the prayers down for you. Mm-hmm. And it's not going to tell you what a magic circle, if you're going to use one, is supposed to look like.
Right.
But if you understand what these spirits are associated with, and you understand the instances appropriate to it, and you could formulate some prayers based on those principles, and you could do it on your own. Mm-hmm. And then conversely, a lot of these grimoires have no philosophy in it.
Exactly.
It's just a book of recipes and nothing else. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's really giving people a lot of false expectations on A, what you can do with just a grimoire, mm-hmm. and B, what you can or can't do with Agrippa, mm-hmm. because they're expecting to have that grimoire part of it as part mm-hmm. of it.
The 4th book of occult philosophy, and I know we're not supposed to talk about that, but that's why I think a lot of people do cotton on to that one, because on magical ceremonies, it's laid out for everybody there, like consecration, mm-hmm. invocation, evocation, constriction, license to part. That's all right there in that small little 15 pages. Mm-hmm. And there's always going to be this debate as to who wrote it and whatnot. But I think that's what people are expecting from the 3 books of occult philosophy. And there's not really that much of that in the 3 books. That's the 4th book. But we're into time now where we do want to have things laid out for us, completely, without, I don't want any of that the 3rd book stuff where you have to talk about philosophy and the divine. We don't. Who wants that? I want to be able to money in the palm right now. I want to be able to cast that spell, and that's not what Agrippa was about. That's not what this book was about.
Nope. And also, magic doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, any kind of magic tradition that's worth its salt will show you that you just can't walk in with guns a-blazing and being able to accomplish everything. It takes years and years and years of study and putting different elements together in your mind and internalizing everything before you can really become successful at that. But until you get to that, you can just read a book and start running with it. Right. It was never that way.
No. I mean, to go back to some of the cooking analogies you were using, anybody can follow a recipe, right? It doesn't mean that what you're going to make is going to turn out to be any good if you don't understand what you're doing in the recipe. You don't understand how the ingredients work together, right? The 3 books show you all of the ingredients, and it teaches you how these ingredients work together, how much salt to add, how much fat, how much acid. It tells you all these things so that when you go and do the magic, right, you have more of a base to work with, right? You understand kind of the elements that you're working with rather than just following a recipe. And I do think the 4th book is useful for people who are maybe read the 3 books, right? Read it a few times and then use the 4th book to get you started. If you don't have a mentor, you're not in a situation where you have anybody that can help elucidate some of this for you. Yeah, use the 4th book to get you started. Right, because then you'll have a better base to work with, and then explore the other grimoires, and you'll quickly see that all of these grimoires and stuff, they're all the incantations and conjurations and stuff, they're all kind of the same and kind of different, and you kind of realize at that point there is no authoritative source on these things, right? It's more important to know the elements of it and how it all works together, so that you can build something that works for you.
Right.
And most importantly, a lot of grimoires have little gaps. When you start practicing them, you'll notice that, wait a minute, they didn't say anything about this, and I'm starting to, whatever, you notice something is kind of off.
Yeah.
And that's where something like this becomes useful, because then you're not just making things up out of thin air or being literal too, and just going with that thing that's left out. By internalizing the method and the philosophy behind it or around it, then you can fill in those blanks out that are there. And it's like in every single magical system, it's like that. They don't tell you everything.
Well, that's the problem a lot of people run into when they first start working the grimoires is some of the ingredients or materials that you need are either extremely hard to come by in the modern world. And so first thing people always ask is like, well, what can I substitute, right? Like, what can I substitute this for that? And by reading the 3 books of occult philosophy, you can understand the thought process behind why those objects were chosen in the first place, like what they represent, right? And that will help you figure out substitutes. Like a lion skin belt being solary, right? Well, you can look at Agrippa and see, okay, what other animals are solary or whatever? Like, okay, crocodiles. Maybe I can get a crocodile skin belt and it'll have sort of a similar effect, right? Or I think also heart skin belt.
Or rooster skin.
Yeah, rooster skin, yeah.
Cockskin, what?
So it's like you can it helps you understand what substitutes you can make as well. It's like without knowing any of that stuff, without knowing why a lion skin belt, why a hazel wand, then you're completely in the dark.
That kind of goes into like its little side discussion. People always talk about doing something literal or not literally.
Yeah.
And the real thing is that we don't exactly know what people did in the past. All we have are the books. And so we don't know if people were scouring far and wide to get these very difficult to find ingredients. And there probably was some of that, I'm sure. And you can do that today. You can get lion skin belts today. But the thing is that realistically, people didn't always do that. And, people often did make substitutions in all times of history. They always had to make do with what they had.
For sure. I have to ask, why do you think that 3 books of occult and philosophy has remained since its publication, perhaps the most important document for magic in the West?
It's all in there.
All of it.
I mean, there's no all of it. No, there's no other book like that. I think the Golden Dawn has a little bit of influence with that, and the fact that there is an English translation that is easy to find. The JF translation has always been easy to find in some form. There were facsimile editions. Eventually, there was Tyson and the Magus, which was you can have your own opinions about that. But so I mean, there's no other book that just has. I said it earlier that encapsulates as much material as it does as 3 books. And no one else did it.
Yeah, I mean that's one reason I've given why I like the 3 books so much is that if I had to Canticle for Leibowitz style preserve the knowledge of magic in the face of an apocalypse, like you could pretty well reconstruct the entire practice of Western magic just from your copy of the 3 books of occult philosophy. That's the book I would have to save, right? Because it's like you said, it's all there.
Your desert island occult book.
Exactly. Like if you had one occult book from your library that you had to pull out of a burning house, like the 3 books is it.
Sure. So how can somebody bring the information from 3 books of occult philosophy into their studies and practices right now for, say, like a very rudimentary ritual? Like, how did you, because you also have a mentor, but how did you start to integrate things from the 3 books into your practice?
That's a difficult question. In my case, I bravely read the whole book cover to cover. And it was the Tyson edition. And some of it was pretty opaque. Most of my practice was, was and is Lucany, and I was able, and I still saw things in that book that applied. And even though we're talking about a different part of the world, a different culture, if you, again, as I said earlier, you strip out the culture part of it and just go with the bare facts, what he's talking about, it applies. It made me think that it kind of takes you out of that space where you're the magician god. And I think that's a very important thing to do. So I think that's probably one of the most immediate effects of reading that book is sort of realizing or helping you integrate that idea that you're just a small little cog in this vast machine.
Wren, how about yourself?
Okay, so as sort of generalized, it's completely revamped like my view, because I've only really read and been introduced to the three books like in the last 3 years, so it's fairly new for me. So it's revolutionized the way I like think about magic and approach it. But on a practical level, like the thing that my mentor was doing that he would always pull out the three books for was actually all the magic squares, right? Like when we would be making or doing like an angelic conjuration, because most of the practice that I was taught and that I work with at the lodge here is sort of like a Trithemian style, like from the Magus, right? Where you have like the pedestal and the little holy table and everything. And so his favorite thing to do was to take, like if we were doing an operation for somebody, we would pick the angel to do the operation, and we would make a talisman just out of a piece of paper that had like the magic square on it and like the intelligence and the seal of the planet and the spirit of the planet. And we would just like put that on the holy table while we do the conjuration. And, that would sort of act as our talisman that we would give the person that we were doing it for. And so from a practical level, like that's what I've used Agrippa for time and time again, right? I just did something the other day where I needed to go do a seal of Mercury and stuff or something. So, but all this stuff, that's like, I couldn't say to like somebody who's a beginner who's doing magic, like that's not necessarily going to be super useful to them, right? Because this is like a specific thing that I reference my copy of as part of a larger practice that I do. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage people, like if they want to bring the three books into their practice, just read the three books. Like Eric mentioned, it's meant to be read from beginning to end. Just take the time to work through it. Buy Eric's new translation of it.
One thing I wanted to add, because I should have mentioned and I forgot, is in my astrological practice, one of the things that I do is I determine the names of people's good and evil diamonds from the astrological chart. And that's something explicitly mentioned in Agrippa. And it's a little bit opaque, though, the way he mentions it, because you have to kind of know traditional astrology to understand it. And I wrote a whole article about that. That's one of the things that I've done, and I've instructed people on how to use it. I can't give people exact instructions of what to do. I mean, because everybody does something different. But to me, the idea of knowing the name as much as it looks like gibberish of your presiding diamonds for an exercise is fascinating. And one of the passages, it was a throwaway passage in Agrippa, where he mentions that in the beginning of anything or some enterprise, you can find the names of these diamonds. And I'm paraphrasing. And I read that, I'm like, wait a minute, that means that you can find presiding diamonds for anything. Mm-hmm. And I've worked with my friend Marcus. He's a blacksmith, and he's made items based on with the diamond names on it as part of the shtick. That's something that I do use quite a bit. It's kind of a fascinating aspect.
My major gripe, and I'm going to throw this out here, and I'll see what you guys think. My major gripe with the three books of occult philosophy is that it assumes a history of magic done since time immemorial, that a lot of us now we know was probably not true. He assumes that the Egyptians had the best magic. It seems like his history is seen through very rose-colored Renaissance eyes. When people read it now, they assume that he's entirely correct in his assumptions about how magic was better in the past. I don't know. Is this something that bothers either of you as well, or is it just me?
Probably just you.
Probably just me.
Yeah. That's something you have to sort of let that go over your head, because he also believes that Hebrew is the oldest alphabet.
Right.
Even though the Egyptians are the oldest, but then the Hebrew, I don't know how that works. But I don't know, that's just part of the world. I mean, they had a different vision of time than we do now. So it is what it is. I mean,
yeah. With all the quotations from Pliny and talking about spontaneous generation and other things, and you kind of have to realize that he's working with the material that he has in his day and age. So yeah, I don't know. It can be forgiven for that. I don't really think you have to read that and take him as gospel on his opinions on that.
I mean, Agrippa does say that that lions cured a headache from eating an ape. So that's.
Yeah, it's just this idea always of that the magic of the past is always like the pure magic. That's
you still do that.
I think is, Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're always looking back at the magic back in Agrippa's day was the best magic. It's like I don't know. I think the magic we have now is pretty good, but
I mean, I think we're in a better position now than we had been in a long time.
Absolutely.
I don't know, but I don't know if it was. I mean, certainly better than the Victorian era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
because the Golden Dawn and Crowley and people like that were using. I mean, all of us have a more extensive library of sources than any of them did, and it's not hard. Just the Esoteric Archives site, has more, and humans have always, looked at a vague past age as being like, as being the golden age, and of course, there's no such thing.
No,
but I think if we look at today, we have much better books available. We have better availability to people who know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. I think it's easier to find those people in some ways. I mean, it's hard to, I guess, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say that. But I do think in some ways it's easier to find people. I mean, I try to imagine, the golden age of, maybe the Hellenistic world or the Egyptians or anybody else. And was it better? Was it easier to find those people? Probably not. There's just not much scamming going on. You probably couldn't read.
I mean, we also too have 500 more years of science and technological development that we can integrate into our magical practice. And I think a lot of people shy away from that. And I don't think as a community we should. Agrippa, I'm sure, was using all of the latest science and mathematical knowledge that he had access to and saw it as part of what he was writing in his practice. And I think it's important for modern magicians to also try to incorporate what they can from modern science and technology into their work, because magicians in the past would have done that.
And that's part of the philosophical part of it too, because, if we use, I don't know, let's make an example of a telescope, or an astrolabe. Astrolabe is probably a better example. That, astrolabe was a invention at some point, but that astrolabe illustrated concepts that were already there. Mm-hmm. And the technology we have, it's not like it comes out of thin air. Mm-hmm. And it does help us change the way we think about things. And something the internet has made us change the way we think of certain things. But at its core, the internet is also just doing what humans have always done. Mm-hmm. It gives us text, it gives us ways to argue. Porn, I don't know.
It collects all of the pertinent information, and if you're willing to look for it,
yes,
it's there for you. Exactly. Final question here, gentlemen. Is 3 books of occult philosophy to this day a necessary book for magicians to have?
Yes and no. If you're doing I hate to say that it's necessary for everybody. I don't think that book exists, but I do think that if you're attempting to do certainly traditional Western magic, I don't see how you could avoid it. I do think that it could be beneficial to some people who don't do Western ceremonial magic. I think that some astrologers could learn things from that book as well. I learned things through a leukemy lens, through the book, by thinking a little bit more broadly. But I'm not going to tell you my leukemy elders, that they should read 3 books either. We have to be realistic with that.
I know I've joked with people on social media about people recommending 3 books of occult philosophy to complete beginners as like their first occult book or whatever, if they're interested in learning magic. And yeah, that is patently ridiculous, right? Like in no way would I give someone the 3 books of occult philosophy if they were like, hey, I'm kind of interested in magic, because it's like, it's just going to completely fry their brain. Like they're not going to be able to synthesize any of it. And so but I do think it is vital. I think if you're serious about it, right? Like if you're learning about magic, Western magic at least, like if you're learning about Western magic and maybe you've read some other books, maybe you read like Modern Magic by Donald Michael Craig or something, just pick up a copy of the 3 books of occult philosophy, because I think it has a place in the library of every sort of Western magician, and it is extremely valuable to actually read. And I mean, I'm talking about this as someone who did magic for like 10, 11 years before I ever really, like, I knew that the 3 books of occult philosophy existed somewhere. Like, I'd seen it on Esoteric Archives and stuff, but I'd never really just like actually used it or read it. And it will change the way you do things. I think it'll make you a more effective magician by trying to actually read through it and understand it. But maybe it's not a great beginner's book.
No.
I mean, the only necessary book for every practitioner is probably the Kabbalion.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's 100% true.
Everybody needs a copy of the Kabbalion, yeah.
It's like every episode I do now is just going to be shitting on the Kabbalah. That's how we end the episode.
Actually,
it's just
Doug, I was actually thinking about rebranding to like being a complete 100% Kabbalion guy, just because I know nothing about the Kabbalion other than everybody I know like hates it. So I'm just like, maybe I should just be like, you know what, everything is true, and just like completely turn into a Kabbalion is the only thing guy.
Sam Block is going to send me a steaming pile in a box.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me to talk about the 3 books of occult philosophy. And I really hope that we were able to elucidate for a lot of people here. It's intimidating. I'm going to say this. If you see the 3 books of occult philosophy, it is intimidating, but try to understand the context of how it was written. Basically, try to take it apart, but also do as Eric and Wren have said. Read it as an actual book. It is like an actual book. The Lord of the Rings. You wouldn't read the 2 Towers before you read the Fellowship, right? So please read it from beginning to end. Wren, I need to know what's going on in your world. Last time we talked, you had a book that you were still writing. You're still working on Chthoniya. Is it called Chthoniya? No.
Yeah, Chthoniya. Yeah, I'm trying to put together sort of a book about catabasis and traveling to the underworld, but also how underworld narratives tie into 90s conspiracy culture about UFOs and underground alien bases and stuff, and Nazi UFO bases in Antarctica, and about how those narratives can be used to guide and manipulate social progression. So I don't know. It's a work in progress. It's probably not going to be out for a very long time, but yeah.
Are you still crafting, sir? Are you still making projects for other people? And
yeah, I've still been making a few things. I haven't put back together my CNC machine, so I haven't been able to do a lot of carving or anything recently, but I've been actually, a lot of the stuff I've been building lately isn't even occult related. It's just I built a whole lot of like hydroponics to grow different vegetables.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I think my next sort of a occult thing I really want to work on is I want to learn how to work in wax. Wax is something I haven't really used much before.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's actually not done very much anymore.
Not anymore.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I've always wanted to make like the full Almadel tablets and all that. Like I always thought that would be really cool to have.
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
Amazing. And Wren, where can people find your work?
Yeah, so you can find me at liminalroom.com, my not often updated blog. But it's got some links on there to a Discord server that I run and some of my other appearances on other shows and some things. And the NAEQ, which you mentioned at the beginning of the show, which is just an online calculator for using the secret cipher of the Euphonauts as described by Alan Greenfield in his book. So yeah, check out just liminalroom.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Wren. And you just literally, this is a bit time sensitive, but you just did an interview with Dara from Spirit Box podcast. And it's actually one of the best interviews I've heard on that show. And I love that show to death. And I love all of the guests, but my gosh, you had a fantastic interview on that show. And I'll put it up in the show notes because everybody should have a listen to it, particularly when Wren is talking about mushrooms. Wren has a very special relationship with mushrooms. Eric, so you've got this book. It's translated. Yes. When does it come out? What's happening with this thing, man? What happens after?
What happens after? The after is already happening. So, 3 books comes out on November 16th, and it is available for purchase on my website and also Inner Traditions website and other traditional, like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, places like that. And it will be available in bookstores. I'm not sure which bookstores besides occult ones, but.
And it's a hardcover.
It's a hardcover. It is in 3 volumes, but it's sold together in a slipcase.
Perfect.
With lots of footnotes in the bibliography and an index.
Look at that. Amazing. And what's happening after the release of 3 books?
So like any undiagnosed ADHD person, I'm working on like 4 books at the same time. So yeah, I'm working a book on leukemia, which has needed to happen, and another translation of an astrology book, and probably a book on astrology as well, just my own book on traditional astrology, and some other stuff which I can't get into too much detail with. And I also have a website. It's ericpurdue.com, and I do astrological readings from that.
Perfect. Wonderful. So if this is interesting to you, and I haven't had a chance to read Eric's translation, but Eric did send me a little snippet of it, and Eric's ambitions with the translation, they seem amazing and awesome, and I cannot wait until it drops. It's one of those things where I was like, do I wait for Christmas? What do I do? And now it's like, no, I need to own this book. So if people want to get a copy of the 3 books of occult philosophy, please try and grab yourself Eric's copy, because it's the first English translation in almost 500 years. Well, yeah, 500 years, basically.
Basically, yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Did you sleep at all when you were doing this thing, or what was happening? Like,
I was just obsessive about it, and I basically had a weekly goal.
Okay.
And I just kept to that goal. It took me, I think, the first draft took me about 4 years, something like that.
Yeah.
And the rest of it was just drafts and lots of editing. Every time you edit that book, you find something new. I think I've been through about, 8 drafts. 9 drafts, something like that. It's had a total of like 5 or 6 editors, I think, over the years.
Jeez, were they jumping from the tops of buildings? What happened? Like, what's?
Oh yeah. Well, my most current editor, we both agreed that our least favorite chapter was the one on auguries with the birds.
Oh, yeah.
I actually had to make a table of the names of the different auguries to make sure that things were straight.
Well, I cannot wait until it hits the shelves, or until I can get it in my hands. That's going to be dropping on the 16th of November. So for all my listeners out there, that's 2 days after my birthday. Anyways, I will have links up to the places in which to find both Wren's work as well as Eric's work, and definitely a place where you will be able to order Eric's new translation of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. All of those links will be available at whatmagicisthis.com. Also in whatmagicisthis.com, I will have a few show notes for this episode. A lot of the show notes are going to be the same ones that are in the Agrippa episode. They're still worth checking out, so please check out the show notes at whatmagicisthis.com. Also there you can find a link to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, as well as my Facebook account. I'm pretty active on Twitter. The other 2, I'm trying to be a bit more active on it, but it's tough sledding some days. What can you do? If you enjoy the show, please leave a review for me either on iTunes or Stitcher or any place that you can leave a review. Those reviews are important, and people do read them, so maybe if you leave a really good one, somebody will want to listen to my show, and I've got a new fan. Another way of getting me a new fan is if you enjoy the podcast, tell a friend. Tell a friend, and then perhaps they'll tell a friend, and then they'll tell a friend, and then that's how this whole crazy snowball that is the What Magic Is This podcast gets rolling. If you want to tell a friend that you enjoy the show, I would greatly appreciate that, and I do enjoy the word of mouth. I don't do the best at marketing my own podcast. I kind of wait for people to come to me. So if you can tell a friend, that would be greatly appreciated. Hey, do you like the work that I do here on What Magic Is This? Do you really want to support this show in some way and say, you know what, Doug, I think you got a good thing going here? Well, now you can. I have a Patreon account, and if you want even more content from What Magic Is This, then you have to sign up for the Patreon. It's only $7 a month. That's it. That's all I ask for, and you get access to videos and episodes, full-length episodes. I'm not just doing 10-minute episodes, although I have done one of those, but there's usually an hour to an hour and a half, and those are full episodes. I also do videos. I just put up a video not too long ago about how to make incense cones. A lot of people love that video. I've done a recent episode on Baphomet. I've done an episode on Hermanubis. But the one that everybody really, really loved is that while this podcast was taking a little bit of a break, a month-long break for the month of September, I released an episode on Saint Cyprian of Antioch, the patron saint of magic and necromancy, who is a saint that I interact with on a very regular basis. Him and I are simpatico. So I released an hour and 20-minute episode all about Saint Cyprian. It's a bit of an introduction. If you want to hear that episode, you got to support the podcast through Patreon. It's only $7 a month. That's all I'm asking. And people really love what I'm doing there. And it also gives you access to a fantastic Discord server that is just the patrons. There's some really wonderful people there, including some of my past guests that have been on the show. And it's a great time, a wonderful community. If you want to support the show, you want to have all of these wonderful things, extra content, Discord server, you have to join the Patreon. So that's at patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or you could head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on any one of the Patreon buttons there. $7, that's it. It's a steal of a deal. So please, if you enjoy the show, come support me. I'd love that. If you want to support the show and you don't feel like paying $7 a month, well, you can click on any one of the PayPal me buttons that's at whatmagicisthis.com. There you can donate anything from $5 to $10 to $20 to $2,000 to $555,000.55. Any amount helps. All of the stuff that's done through the PayPal, it goes right back into running this podcast. That pays for my website hosting, for my podcast hosting, a whole swag of other stuff. And if you want to support the show, but you don't want to sign up for Patreon, find the PayPal me buttons on my website. And yes, that goes straight back into the podcast and keeping it running, keeps the fires on. All of these things can be found at whatmagicisthis.com. Head there to have all your What Magic Is This needs met. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast, and I really appreciate just spending time talking to me about these books. And I know that there was a lot of great information that people that are interested in the 3 books of occult philosophy to take with them when they do finally get a copy of the 3 books. So again, I want to thank everybody for listening to What Magic Is This? And we're going to talk a little bit more about this as magic, this weird, crazy, occultish, strange, esoteric stuff. But until then, I want everybody to stay healthy, stay happy, and stay luminous. Until next time.
Hi, everyone.
Goodbye. Thanks for having us. Yeah.
Perfect. And until then, we'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.